I'd like to introduce Dr. Angela Roberts. Angela has a joint appointment in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders and the Department of Computer Sciences, which is very interesting, at Western University in Ontario, Canada. She's trained as a speech language pathologist, and so this really shows kind of that multidimensional nature of these collaborations. She's a founding co-director of Western's Collaborative Specialization in Machine Learning in Health and Biomedical Sciences, and is a research associate with the Canadian Centre of Activity and Aging. And I've had the great fortune of serving on a working group with Angela, and also had the opportunity recently to listen to her group give a very interesting presentation of their impactful research related to superagers, with a small preview about some of the findings with wearable sensors. So I'm excited for Dr. Roberts to share her work and for us to have the opportunity to discuss it with her. Please feel free throughout the presentation to send questions to Diane and I through the chat that we can discuss afterwards, or you can unmute yourself at the end of the presentation and ask Angela questions yourself. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you all for the invitation today. I truly meant, if you kind of heard me say this to Maureen as I came on, I hope this really turns out to be a dialogue at the end. Your group has so much expertise, and I'm really eager to learn from you as much as I'm eager to kind of share the work that we get to do. So I am going to screen share here, and let's just make sure we've got everything kind of set up. And then I'm going to start the presentation. You guys can let me know. Are you able to see the proper view? Is that a yes or no? I can't see you, so if someone can just say yes.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, sounds great. As my introduction kind of indicated, I'm a professor at Western University, and I have the joy of holding a joint appointment. I'm also the Canada Research Chair in Data Analytics and Digital Health in aging and dementia. And so what that means from a larger scope is that I play a role in setting a lot of the research agenda that happens in Canada relative to aging and digital health kind of components, as well as interventions in dementia. So, my role is a lot of fun, both as a researcher and as a teacher, but also as someone who gets to work in the public policy space. Here are my disclosures. I'll just slide past those. But what I'm hoping we really get the opportunity to do today is to engage in a conversation around how our group thinks about deploying wearable sensors to better understand mechanisms and predictors of outcomes across this cognitive aging continuum. And so our work really spans, from neurodegeneration and people who have dementia and Parkinson's disease, all the way to the other end of the spectrum in exceptional cognitive aging. And so today I'm going to share with you kind of two studies that we have in this space, really that are centered on this aspect of kind of co-designing both how we share the information with people who use wearable sensors in our studies, but also how we co-design our data collection methods. And then I'll give you a sneak peek at some of the data that we've actually, that we're learning, some of the lessons that we're learning from our superagers, and why those are so critical in terms of better understanding, people that we're also interested in helping at the other end of this aging spectrum, people with dementia and people with neurodegenerative disease. So I just kind of alluded to our interest spans, and we're an unusual research program. And that we just don't look at kind of really exceptional aging or neurodegeneration, but as I indicated, our interest is in going across this full spectrum. In large part because when we were doing research in neurodegeneration, we found that often when we were looking at typical aging controls, what we might define as typical aging, that those folks, many of them, if we followed up with them, within 2 or 3 years, were also developing the same diseases that we were intending to study. And since we know that the prodromal period for many of these neurodegenerative diseases and dementias can be as long as 10 to 15 years, what we realized that we were actually using as controls are people who are actually at the edge of having neurodegeneration. And so we decided that wasn't a very good control group model. And so we started seeking, and actually by accident discovered that we could tap into these really rich cohorts of people who are older, but who don't seem to be kind of yielding to the same aging processes that we expect, and certainly have a lower likelihood of developing significant neurodegenerative processes. And I'll talk a little bit about them toward the end of my talk today. But really, the kind of core focus of our research program is to understand these aging mechanisms, not just as they occur across the spectrum, but using very specific behaviors. And those are behaviors that are free living behaviors that occur in everyday environments. Our group has a real focus in thinking about improving disease management and aging outcomes through aiding in kind of personal and clinical decisions. And we do this through the use of remote data collection. We look at everything from whole body movements, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, all the way to more granular speech-based biomarkers of disease progression and aging outcomes, which is another branch of the work that's done in my research group. And part of what we do is actually develop FDA-approved speech-based biomarkers that can be used to help people participate in clinical trials who otherwise might not be able to do so because they live at such a distance from academic medical centers. So we're really in this game of thinking about not only how people are aging, but can we actually improve clinical care? And another large focus for us is thinking about self-management and self-efficacy. And so we're all about how do you use technology, how do you use, particularly in our case, wearable sensors, to be able to help people change their healthcare themselves. So how can we, kind of facilitate positive health behavior changes as people get older? So I'm going to start by sharing some of our work from the Hands Ontario study. And this study was a large kind of observational study that we ran in the province of Ontario. We actually closed that study in August of this year. And we'll be starting a new iteration of it in next year in 2025. One of the reasons that we did this study, we were interested in kind of thinking about not only improving our methods for collecting data and free living behaviors using fully remote paradigms, but we were aware that amongst this kind of tremendous growth of wearable sensors and technologies that are used in health monitoring, there's very little research actually dedicated to how do we optimize those methods for sharing data and for generating information in such a way that it's really digestible and usable by people that matter most, which includes people who are actually using the technologies, living at home, older adults, and people with cognitive impairment and people with neurodegeneration. So it struck us that a lot of the commercial products that were being created had this really one-size-fits-all approach. And whereas people might be engaged in the early stage of designing those technologies, smart watches and other devices that people wear at home, there was very little engagement of people with cognitive impairment or people with neurodegeneration or even their families in trying to understand what the output should look like and how those outputs might be used to actually, create meaningful change in their everyday health behaviors and those behaviors that were important for managing disease. And so we set about doing this kind of co-design process where we worked with people who have neurodegeneration, Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. We worked with people who actually had mild to moderate dementia, their care partners. We engaged physicians who were treating physicians of several of the folks that were in our study, but also just more globally, cognitive neurologists, stroke neurologists. We engaged social workers, health policy makers, but we brought them all to the table to say, if we were going to think about designing a feedback report that was really usable for people, how might we do that? And so we kind of gathered this group of people with the goal of developing this kind of end user accessible feedback report. And then we wanted to work on how would you establish the methods to kind of facilitate delivering that. So we took on a participatory research model. What you're seeing in this kind of diagram, our work traditionally uses an ECG sensor positioned at the chest and two IMUs, one on the wrist and one on the ankle. For some of our data collection, we might use bilateral IMUs on the wrist and on the ankles, but most often we'll use a single IMU on the wrist and a single one on the ankle. I am aware that lots of people will just use watch-based systems. I'm aware that there's a lot of people who will use an IMU at the base of the spine for collecting data. In our experience, especially in the older cohorts that we work with, some individuals who are north of 100 years of age, we actually find that this sensor configuration works better for us in terms of accuracy of data and being able to capture a large range of movements. And so you're going to see that throughout the work I present to you today, that this is the base kind of configuration that we use for our data collection. In addition to actually creating a report that we knew could be derived from sensor data, we also employed this specific decision criteria or framework, and we worked with our stakeholders. They were integrated kind of in this decision process. And I'll share that framework with you for a minute, in just a minute, because I think it's an important part of this research. And then we created a feedback report that we kind of iterated over 2 different distinct data collection cycles and 3 different feedback periods. So this was the framework that we used for decision-making criteria. We actually published this in a paper that I helped to lead that came out last year. But we really have this kind of central framework that we took into our stakeholder or our participant kind of informed design, co-design process. And at every stage, we engaged our full stakeholder panel in trying to understand the research around how it couldn't just be factors that we thought really worked for people or people wanted to measure in their everyday life, but we had to make sure that the metrics that we included in our feedback report, the measures that we were actually pulling off of the wearable sensors, were also informed by clinical best practice. And that's the clinician in me. Maureen introduced that I'm a speech language pathologist. So for me, they couldn't just be cool analytics that could actually come off the sensors. They had to be analytics and measures that were actually clinically interpretable and that were grounded in evidence. And so you'll see here the framework that we used, and these were the questions that we asked. You know, we were first interested, what are the domains of health that are interested to our stakeholders? Is there evidence that a particular measure it actually is a valid measure to be using in the clinical tracking of aging or the clinical tracking of disease status? We had to make sure that the measures themselves, of course, could be pulled technically, were feasible for us to derive from the wearable sensors. And we really made sure, again, that everything that we brought into this was, again, co-informed by what users thought were important to their own personal health, but also co-informed by the evidence in the literature. And so my recommendation for anyone who's kind of engaging in this co-design process, and I'm sure your group does this, is actually to make sure that you're kind of taking a framework like this into your co-design process so that you're anchoring all the decisions that you make and something that has an evidence-based foundation. So this is just a schematic of how we kind of organized our study. We had a phase 1 and phase 2, and within phase 1, we had 2 full cycles of prototype development. And at each cycle, we met with our stakeholder group. We used that framework to consolidate our findings to make sure that we were aligning with the best available evidence. We would then go in and collect a batch of data using our wearable sensors. We would generate a prototype of the report. We would gather user feedback. We'd advance the report, and we'd go right back into the cycle again. And some of the data that I'm going to share with you today, or actually all the data I'll share with you today, comes from our phase 2 study, which is where we actually deployed the full feedback report and our sensor wearing paradigm in a sample of 215 people. So 100 older adults who were controls, community dwelling controls, and 115 individuals who were people with neurodegenerative disease, the majority of whom had Alzheimer's, dementia, or who had Parkinson's disease. But this gives you an idea. So this actually, the entire process took almost 2 years for us to get an actual fully working version of the report that we thought was suitable for deploying, not only in a research context, but in a clinical context. So what you're seeing on this slide is an overall schematic of one version of the report. So you're looking at pages of that report from sedentary behavior. I should note that one of the features that was super important to us as we developed this was that it could be generated from a fully automated pipeline. And indeed, that's what we actually have. So we can take, and we often do take raw data from a variety of different sensors. They can be different manufacturers, they can be different types of sensors, but as long as we can get access to the raw data, we can run that through our current pipeline. And the output of that pipeline is actually this physical report. And we're incredibly proud of this. So I should say this, we've made this feature completely available on GitHub. I can share that with you. We just published a paper on what's called our NimbleWare pipeline. So all of this is fully accessible to the field for anyone who wants to use it. We believe in open science and we've made that available. But what you see here is kind of our base version of the report. That has physical activity, sedentary time, mobility, sleep, and nighttime behavior. And the report is divided into 3 sections. We provide people with this high-level summary that describes all of the measures that they're seeing in their report and where that data came from. So in our earliest versions of this, we had people who were really questioning the truth of the data that we were providing to them because they just could not envision that this came off their wearable sensors. And so we actually discovered that we had to provide people a bit of a primer on what wearable sensors were and where these data came from and the measures that we actually used to generate data for them. It was the only way that people accepted the data as having some truth that would they felt gave them confidence in changing their health behaviors. And then we have a level 2 that we call the weekly summary of data. This provides just kind of an overall global picture of someone's activity. In this case, you're seeing the sedentary behavior measure for each day that they wore the sensors. And we traditionally have sensors in the field on people for 7 to 10 days of continuous wear. That's our most often use case application. And then we have a third layer in the report that is pattern of behavior. And what you see in this visualization under pattern of behavior is an hour by hour perspective of what their behavior is like over 24 hours a day. So this notion of this kind of 3 levels of information, both the high level summary, this weekly summary, and this pattern of behavior, along with the education components, that was completely driven by our stakeholders. And it was really driven by family members and people with lived experiences who felt that it was important that for them to change their behaviors, they needed to be able to receive feedback at different levels of granularity. So that maybe for sleep behavior, they were interested in an hour by hour activity report, but relative to their physical activity or sedentary behavior, they might just really want a weekly summary. And so this kind of build out of the report actually came directly from their feedback. I should say that we continue to advance the analytics in this space. And I'm happy to talk in the discussion group about some of the sensors that we've been actually building to collect social engagement data. But one of the analytics that's actually under development now and should be available in the pipeline by early next year is actually a marker of social engagement, where we have a sensor that collects speech-based data and can give us an idea about the amount of talking time, the relative level of engagement based on measures such as fundamental frequency and voice variability, the amount of time that people spend talking to other people. And we're kind of have built out an indices that correlates quite well with people's self-rating of social isolation, social engagement, and loneliness. And so we'll be working that into this pipeline as part of our custom and kind of standard analytics, and also have a component of that is in the feedback report as well. And so as I was saying, this kind of layers of information became a really important component of a design element that was completely informed by our stakeholders. It should not surprise you. I'm as I said, I'm a speech language pathologist by training. So it was really critical that we built in multimodal communication supports. And I wish I could send all of you a report, and maybe I will send one to Maureen just so your group has one that you can go through. But this is a multi-page report. We use communication supports, including pictures, simplified language, standard icons, to really help people to be able to understand what this report is telling them, even those who have early stage cognitive changes. The report itself is designed for flexibility. So if your study or your client or the physician is only interested in measuring sleep behavior or sedentary behavior in their patients, they can pick just to use those modules out of the pipeline. For many of our studies, we use the full gamut of the analytics that are at our disposal. But we built it so that people could plus and minus out the modules that were most were of most interest to them. And then a key component that we heard in this kind of co-design process was this need for supported delivery. So we actually have a brief orientation and education video that goes with the feedback report that walks people through how to interpret the data in their report. We built out a glossary and guideline that can be used for research studies or used for clinicians when they want to review their reports with maybe one of their patients. So it's a kind of a guided process to help clinicians and to help others in kind of the research ecosystem to work with and describe their report and talk to family members about what's in the report. And then in some of our studies, we actually use a very brief kind of one-on-one data review. It depends on you know, the study that we're doing. So I'm provided, there we go. So I'm going to share with you some of the results. This is from our Hands Ontario study, and I hope you find these as exciting as I do. So participants in the study, as I said, we had 100 controls. Everyone was over the age of 60. We had 115 people with neurodegenerative disease, the majority of whom had Alzheimer's, dementia, or Parkinson's disease. They wore the sensors for 7 to 10 days. Again, like most of the things we do, this is a fully remote protocol. So we send the sensors out, they send the sensors back. We offloaded the data. In this kind of 2 to 4 week range, we gave them a feedback report. For this study, we were still in a development stage. We can now generate those reports in under an hour once the data are offloaded into the pipeline. And so it's a pretty quick turnaround. We gave them their feedback report. They had a very brief meeting with one of our research team to go over the education video that goes with this. We gave them 2 weeks of having their feedback report in hand, having an explanation of how to interpret the report. We provided them no guidance on changing their health behaviors. So the education session we provided was really just, here's the report, here's how you use it, here's how you interpret it. But we gave them zero guidance on how to change their behaviors in accordance with the report. And then we gave them 2 weeks with it, and then we brought them back to kind of conduct these guided interviews on how they use the information. I should say kind of one important part of how we do these reports, and I think I failed to mention that here, is that when we benchmark activity, when we tell someone that they're average, low, or high, we're using actually evidence-published standards for that. Based on activity levels for people either 50 years of age, 60 years of age, 80 years of age. Here in Canada, we have really good activity standards set out by age. And that's what we actually use to kind of benchmark, telling people whether or not they were in a high, medium, or low level of activity. So when we asked them about whether or not the feedback form was digestible and helpful, we felt like this was a really important component of what we needed to do. More than 80% of them found that it was helpful. They found in general that it was readable and interpretable, and overall they rated it as being helpful. Here in these graphs, NDD means person who had a neurodegenerative disease. And a control is, you know, someone who is 60 and over, who's a community dwelling control without any evidence of having a neurodegenerative process. We further looked at these data by having low cognition and high cognition. And again, you'll see that even people in our low cognition group generally found the report helpful or very helpful and found it easy to read or easy to understand. So we thought this was a really good kind of proof of concept for the fact that our co-design model worked well. The majority of people went on to share their feedback report with other family members, which we also found to be positive. Again, a first stage in health behavior change is actually reaching out and kind of making others aware that you want to make a change, and that's kind of one component of health behavior change. And indeed, we saw that the report was effective for both people with brain diseases and controls in being able to do that. When we asked them why they shared their report with family members, there were a variety of reasons. Most people wanted help in making a lifestyle change. But in other cases, they actually wanted to prove to their family members that their perception that they were sleeping well, not sleeping well, active, not active, was actually true. And many of our people with neurodegenerative diseases felt that their family members and physicians often didn't believe them in terms of what they were doing in health behaviors, either to the positive or to the negative. And they used these reports to really advocate for themselves. Again, kind of an important stage in self-management. When we asked people, did they make a behavior change? So keep in mind, this was within 2 weeks, right? So this is about, 4 to 6 weeks after they've worn the sensors, 2 weeks with this report. And we were really surprised. I mean, I would have said I didn't think this many people would have made a behavior change this quickly, but indeed about 65% of controls and 53% of people with brain diseases made at least one or more positive health behavior changes within this very short time period, with no specific instruction to do so, and with nothing more than really an overview of the report. We saw things such as people joining Pilates classes. And again, all of these actions and awareness examples come from people with neurodegenerative disease. Some of them requested an appointment with their health provider. One person requested a sleep study to be done, and it was actually granted by their health provider. Someone else started a new sleep hygiene routine. From an awareness standpoint, people started monitoring their sedentary behavior. Even if they didn't start an exercise class, many of them had signed up for an exercise class or requested health information. So to kind of wrap up, and as I transition to our SuperAging work, because a lot of what you'll see in the SuperAging study was built out of this work. We actually found we were able to feasibly build out an automated pipeline that could generate a report that was co-designed with older adults, tailored to the needs of people with neurodegenerative disease, that the report had high user acceptance, even for those who had cognitive impairment. And in work that we're starting to build upon now, and again, the study in 2025 will certainly start toward this, really thinking about how we systematically use these kind of co-designed feedback reports to help facilitate positive behavior change, with this kind of early data, giving us an idea that even in relatively short time scale, that can happen. So I'm going to transition here to our SuperAging Research Initiative and spend a few minutes with you before I kind of open it up for questions, and really looking forward to your thoughts on some of our co-design work, and also how we started to stretch that into this new cohort. But as I mentioned before, the concept of doing superagers is an important one for us, but I'll tell you who a superager is first. They are people 80 years of age and older whose memory performance is at least average for people who are 50 to 65 years of age. So they're performing in a memory capacity that is almost 20, if not 30 years or more so younger than what their actual biological chronological age is. Their performance in other cognitive domains has to be at least average for age. It doesn't have to be exceptional, but it has to be at least average for their age. And I want to take just a brief moment here to say there's lots of different ways of defining superagers. In fact, there's a recent review that says one of the challenge in this exceptional aging space is that people define them differently. But a key measure here is that ours requires a minimum age, and ours is actually based on cognitive performance. So we aren't talking about physical superagers here, although some of them are. We're talking about true cognitive superagers. And as I, kind of alluded to at the beginning, why did we do this? Because there's so many things superagers can teach us beyond the fact that they're just the coolest group of people in the world. Like I must say that. And beyond the fact that they have many life lessons to teach us, one of the things that they really help us to understand is not just what's going wrong, but what's going right. And that was the entire component of the SuperAging Research Program, so that we could help people in cases where neurodegeneration was coming into where maybe they were yielding to some of the age-related processes that led to dementia and other cognitive impairments. We wanted to understand what were the protective factors, both living factors as well as biological factors and genetic factors, that might actually help us really understand what happens when it's going right. In this particular version of our SuperAging study, we do have a strong interest, and we've expanded our recruitment to ensure that we're understanding, because previous SuperAging research has largely been in individuals who were white. We have expanded, and in our current study, at least 40% of our cohort is currently, and we intend to keep it that way, are Black individuals with this need to understand what their lived experiences are and the predictors of aging in a non-white group. So the history of our SuperAging initiative, we've actually been around for about 10 years, but in 2021, we expanded this to a multi-site study. And in 2023, we moved the core of our research program from Northwestern University to the University of Chicago. But we have my site in Canada, which is one of the larger sites and is the source of the data I'll show you today. We also have sites at Emory, Michigan, Northwestern, Rush in Chicago, and the University of Wisconsin. We, like many longitudinal studies, collect a lot of data. We have MRI data, we have complex genetics data, we look at lifestyle behaviors, neuropsychological assessments, markers of inflammation. This is kind of the basic menu of items that you'll see in any observational study in aging. But one of the unique things that we do is this lifestyle factors under Project One, and that's the study that I helped to lead. And in the Project One study, this is where we've taken everything we've used from our Hands Ontario and other bodies of research, brought it into this SuperAging space to really try to understand how free living behaviors are associated with this cognitive aging trajectory that leads to exceptional cognitive performance. And here is my full team. I have to say thank you to them now because I'm sure I'll run out of time at the end. But this is a real partnership between my team and colleagues in sleep at Sunnybrook Research Institutes, and then my colleagues, Dr. Bill McElroy and Karen Van Edegem at the University of Waterloo. So this isn't a neuroimaging talk, this is a sensor talk, but I do want to let you in on a few of the knowledge, bit of the knowledge that we've gained from working with superagers over the years. And one of the things that we know is this cognitive superaging performance that we see is also correlated with slower rates of atrophy compared to age-matched peers. So if you look at this kind of top figure here, this kind of is labeled A, you're looking at a contrast between the brains of an atrophy patterns in middle-aged controls. So those are people in their 50s and 60s compared to elderly controls, which are people 80 and over who do not have dementia, who have age-typical cognitive performance. So in our superaging studies, our controls are also people who are 80 and over, who don't have dementia, who do not have a neurodegeneration process, but who are, cognitive performance would be what we would expect for an 80-year-old. And in many ways, they're the typical agers that you might see in many studies. But what you'll see here is bilaterally, what is clear is that older adults, and these red and yellow areas are indicators of atrophy compared to people who are middle-aged. And so not unexpectedly, in these older controls, you're seeing significant atrophy of multiple brain regions. But when you look at this bottom plate, this is the comparison of our superagers versus middle-aged controls. And you'll notice there's no red and yellow in that picture. And there's no red and yellow because they actually are not demonstrating the atrophy expected for age. In fact, there's no difference in the atrophy patterns in their brains in people who are 25 and 30 years younger. In fact, we see an enhancement. And if you look at this bottom slide, let me see if I can get my pointer up. If you look at this bottom slide right here, oops, sorry. always happens. If you look at this kind of blue space, I'm not sure that you're able to see it on your side because it can be a little bit hard, but there's a blue spot right in the anterior cingulate cortex. It actually is thicker. It's an area of enhancement that we see in superagers that we actually do not see in typical agers. And we think this correlates with the neuropathological finding that I'll show you on the next slide, which is right in this region, we see a higher density of what we call von Economo neurons. And we think that that increased density of von Economo neurons, which are large pyramidal neurons, are actually accounting for that increased volume. And one of the reasons why this finding is so important is, previously we've not really known what these neurons did. What we thought they did in elephants and whales was to control social behavior and pod behavior. And it's interesting to us because when we look at our superagers behaviorally, one of the things that really distinguishes them from their typical controls is that they do have and rate a stronger degree of meaningful social relationships. Now, this becomes important. I told you that part of the things that we're trying to develop with this study are measures of social engagement that correlate with social isolation, that correlate with measures of loneliness, because we're trying to, and while we don't have those data quite ready for today, what we've been doing is collecting data to actually track whether the fact that superagers are reporting that they're more socially engaged is something we can actually quantify in their everyday behaviors. Because it certainly would then be an interesting finding to consider that with this kind of enhancement that we see in these increased density of von Economo neurons in this anterior cingulate region. But other things that superagers have told us in past studies, and not just our work, but other exceptional aging cohorts around the world, is that they tend to get more sleep, they tend to watch less TV, they have a more positive outlook on life, and some, but not all, are physically active. So that's fantastic that they tell us that. But what we actually have never had is objective evidence from their everyday lives outside of surveys and scales that they fill out that would confirm whether this is actually true or not. Enter our lab and what we do as part of this study. So this should look really familiar to you. It's the same array that we used in the Hans Ontario study. And for all the same reasons, we find that having a true ECG system is much more accurate for us than having a PPG heart rate based system. Remember, I said that one of our goals of this study is to have greater diversity, particularly with a focus on Black individuals. And so that PPG signal is just not as reliable as we'd like for it to be. And so we use a true ECG system. But it's the same setup that we've used for all of our studies. This workflow, or how we collect data, is another evidence of co-design. And so I won't go into the details of that here for time, but just like our previous protocol where we developed the feedback report, here we actually spent a lot of time working with superagers from our prior studies to actually have them help us create this co-design protocol. It is 100% remote. We never have any physical contact with the superagers in this Project One workflow. Sensors are mailed out. There's an orientation visit with our team. People open up their sensors. They put them on largely by themselves. We have intermittent visits with them over the course of the 10 to 14 days that they have the sensors. We offer rest breaks so that people can take the sensors off. Then they put the sensors back on. And then at the final visit, we help them to package the sensors up. It's returned to us in a courier package, and then data are offloaded and run through the pipeline. So to date, we have completed this on 70 people, all over the age of 80, with the oldest person to date being 98. But I will say I have a 106-year-old individual who's scheduled to wear the sensors next week. And by all appearances, she's going to do fantastic with it. When we have any challenges with enrollment, it's typically because of skin concerns. So we do find that older skin is a little bit more sensitive to some of these adhesives. Oftentimes, the reasons why people may not participate right away is they're too busy. So superagers are incredibly busy individuals. Catching them to run a data protocol is a really challenging thing to do. And oftentimes they'll say, yep, I'll do that when I get back from Spain in 6 weeks. And so we end up having to do some delayed data collection. But overall, they're just a really busy group. But one of the chief reasons why we sometimes have difficulty getting people enrolled into the study is just the coordinator's ability to discuss the devices and outcomes. So our site coordinators enroll people into Project One, and then my team takes over from there. And you'll see here, and I put this data here because I think it's important when you're designing studies and to think about this, that our range of being able to recruit into Project One is anywhere from 33% to 75%. That's a lot of variability. And one of the things that we find is a hindrance toward getting coordinators to enroll into this study is their own internal biases, their belief that these older adults cannot use technology. But I'm going to show you some data that completely throws that out the door. And we have to often remind our folks that people are actually able to use these sensors with quite good ease, and we get really good quality data. So I'm showing you, I said we had 70 completed to date. I'm showing you at least an early run of data on compliance on 44 of our participants. I will say that the data on the 70 look very similar to this. I just couldn't get that table updated in time for this presentation. But what you're looking at is the ankle, wrist, and the chest sensor. And the mean percentage accuracy, and what that means is the mean amount of data that we would expect to receive based on the days that we know people were wearing the sensors is 99%, typically, ranging all the way up to 100. What this means is we have very little data loss because the sensors aren't working, people aren't wearing them properly, people are taking them off on a weird schedule, or people are not tolerating them. In general, we're able to get around 6 days, on average, around 6 days of data wear out of around a 10-day wear period. And recall that I said we allow people to take the sensors off for a sensor break. And so they may have the sensors off on a scheduled break for a couple of days. Our minimum criteria for data, and this comes from the literature, is 4 24-hour cycles. And so we're getting well above that. The point being that people 80 years old and older are having zero issues with getting the technology on properly, managing the technology, and using it to where we get good quality data. We really do have very minimal data loss. The greatest data loss we've had is in the chest sensor, in people where the adhesive might be too irritating, and we actually have them take the sensor off and don't let them put the sensor back on. So that's often, if we run short of data, it's with that ECG sensor. So I want to highlight these factors for you too. Fewer than 5% of our participants have needed a study partner for anything. A couple of them have needed it for putting the devices on. 2 of them have needed it for using the Zoom technology to hold the visits with our staff. But we think this number is remarkable when you consider the fact that these people are 80 and over. And this is true for our SuperAgers as well as their controls. We've had very few withdrawals or incomplete data collections in the study. That's around 3%, and largely due to dermatological complications. And over 70 participants, an average of 10 days of wear, so 700 days of wear. We've had a total of 6 calls for technology support calls. Now, when you put that in alignment with the fact that our data quality is incredibly high and our data loss is minimum, we think this is remarkable. And I'm highlighting it because it all goes into this co-design process. Remember, we co-designed a protocol with people who are actually going to be doing the protocol. And so that intentionality and the time spent on that front end really makes a difference in terms of what you get in the data. Where we're getting close on time, but I do want to show you a little bit of data here. So this is summary data for, again, the same 44. I can't say it looks very different for the 70 because it actually looks really similar for the 70 participants. What you have here are lines that benchmark these activities. And so this is how I commonly report these data. We benchmark it against the activity recommendations for people 65 and older. And what you'll see is that in general, across these good controls, right? Because these are 80-year-old controls with no cognitive impairment or are superagers, that they generally, their sleep levels fall a little bit below the expected standards, but their activity levels are higher. One of the things we also notice that their sedentary behavior is a little bit higher. I will say this moderate to vigorous physical activity, this MVPA measure, is driven a little bit more by the superagers, and the sedentary behavior is driven a little bit more by controls. But in general, even at 70 people, if we just look at these global or kind of cumulative measures of activity, we're not seeing a tremendous amount of difference between the two groups, which is why we think this next stage is really important. So we think it's critical, and I want to encourage anybody who's using wearable sensors to not just look at kind of global aggregate measures of activity, because we think they're deceptive. In fact, when we break down and look at individual activity patterns between superagers and controls, and across superagers and across controls, we actually think it's these individual patterns that become really important. And one of the things that we actually see is a high degree of kind of individual variability. And in fact, the analytics that we intend to eventually use for these data are based more in complexity measures and complexity indices that allow us to kind of capture some of this dynamic response in the signal, because we are of a firm opinion, both from this work and our previous work in neurodegeneration, that global measures of activity can be somewhat deceptive in this space with wearable sensors. But one of the things I'll point out here, so this is a superager compared to one of our control participants. What you see in the superager is that you have these longer bouts of sedentary behavior with these kind of short bursts of moderate to vigorous activity. But what you'll also observe, and this is typical for what we see in superagers, is that that activity tends to occur at a regular time of day. So they don't all have their bulk of activity in the morning or at night or midday, but you see this kind of day-to-day pattern. Each one of these rows is actually a day of data. Each one of these epochs that you see going across horizontally is an hour of data. But it's really clear that you see this chunk of green or moderate to vigorous physical activity in blue, even their light activity kind of in the early part of the day when you're looking at the superager data. When we look at the control participant on the right-hand side, you still see these long bouts of sedentary behavior, but with these short, infrequent bursts of light activity, much less moderate to vigorous physical activity. But again, it's just not as regular. It's much more randomly kind of distributed throughout the day. And again, this difference in regularity versus distributed activity and less predictability is something that kind of shows up time and time again when we're looking at these activity measures in our superagers versus controls. Here again is a bit of an example of some sleep data. These are two superagers. But you see here, they're both extremely regular in when they go to bed and when they get up. Again, we're not necessarily seeing that superagers sleep more than non-sleep superagers. We're not even seeing a difference in their fragmentation of sleep, but what we are seeing is a regularity in their sleep hygiene and their sleep habits. So superagers, the one on the left goes to bed at a pretty predictable time, 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. and gets up at 6 a.m. every day. The superager on the right goes to bed at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and gets up at noon every day. So two completely different sleep patterns in these superagers, but the observation is of the regularity. And again, if we're looking at this in a control sample, we tend to see much more irregular habits around when people are going to bed. And although we're not necessarily seeing any disruptions in sleep fragmentation, there's a slight increase in sleep fragmentation for the control group that we think is driven by this kind of irregular sleep patterns. Again, one last slide here to kind of really drive home this fact of why we think global measures are not the best way to look at these data. So this is a comparison of moderate to vigorous physical activity between a superaging participant and a control participant. The basic kind of volume-based data are almost identical between these two, but their patterns of behavior are very different. So if we're looking at the superager, we get these longer bouts of moderate to vigorous physical activity, these intermittent bursts of light activity. and much shorter bouts of sedentary behavior. We look over to the right in the control participant, and we see shorter bouts of moderate to vigorous physical activity. You see much more blue in each of those day rows, which gives us an idea that they're doing more light activity than MBPA, and longer bouts of sedentary behavior. And this again is why we think you have to be cautious with these volume-based measures. If we just look at those, it looks like there's zero difference between superagers and controls. But clearly when we break out these pattern-based data, we start to see differences in how people are living and engaging in their lives outside in their real world activities that we think is an important contributor perhaps to why they're aging and maintaining a positive aging status. I think one of the things that's important to realize about superagers, they're not just superagers at one point in time. They often maintain that superaging status until death. And for many of our superagers, that can be another 20 years. We have superagers that are 101, 102 years old who still have atrophy patterns similar to 50-year-olds and whose cognitive performance is still like a 50-year-old. So they're resilient to these processes even after the age of 80. I think I'll leave it with the summary slide here, but do want to kind of highlight just the next steps for us include longitudinal data collection, continual advancement of analytics, and really moving forward with thinking about how we use these feedback reports in some of our social engagement analytics. But yeah, thank you for your time. Thanks for kind of looking over this with me. Really happy to engage in a conversation about these data and what we've learned from both of these studies.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was very interesting. Lots of really great things, I think, for our group to be thinking about. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions for Angela. And just feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask the question. Well, I guess I can start. Oh, Katie has a question. Go ahead, Katie.
Sorry to interrupt you, Marie.
That's okay.
Angela, that was wonderful. It was really exciting to see the superagers and how you like came up with that across the continuum, especially with our participants. It's what everyone wants to be. And so it's like, and they like always get nervous if they feel like they're falling behind on that too. So that's just exciting. One of my questions for you, we can start off with is, I agree that your adherence seems remarkable with your sensors. And one thing that we've been talking about recently is trying to brainstorm some ways to increase our adherence, like especially with our smartwatches. We might see that people might wear them for the first 3 days and then never put it back on. And so one thing that I feel like might be different is that with our with the smartwatches, like we have to, the participants have to interact with those. With your sensors, are those completely passive?
Yes. And so I agree that this is something we think is really important. We try as much as possible when we're working with these cohorts to use completely passive approaches. So we initialize the sensors before we put them in the mail. We timestamp that. They receive it. We have them do, a little bit of a coordination activity to make sure that we've got another time marker in the movement of the sensor itself once they receive it, but they never have to initialize. They do have to, if they take the bidium off for their wear breaks, sometimes occasionally the ECG sensor will die, just like we'll have a weird battery issue and we might have to have them plug it back in. So we do send the charger. But for the most part, we try to focus on tech that either is completely passive or minimal engagement. So the wearable sensor that we've designed for speech, because it has to sample at such a high rate, the battery life and the form factor of the sensor, which is quite small, can't sustain a 10-day data collection without charging the device. However, the charger we built was co-designed with older adults who have mobility issues. And so literally they take it off and just set it on the charger. It offloads the data immediately, takes it up to a cloud, and then the next day, all they have to do is put another adhesive on and stick it on. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the amount of engagement. We try to minimize charging, and if charging has to happen, we choose a really simple interface for that.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
So Katie, I think the other thing I'd offer is the other thing that's super helpful is that, and we've discovered this over a couple of studies now, the idea of a scheduled wear break. So we think it's and we've tried it with and without. And our compliance, our adherence tends to be higher if people know that they're going to wear the sensor for 4 days and get a break from it, right? They can then push out to that time point, and they're much more agreeable at them putting it on the next round. So when we were just collecting 7 to 10 days continuous and not offering people a break, we don't actually need the break for the sensors, right? They'll maintain their charge all the way throughout the 10-day wearing period, with the exception of the speech sensor. But we give them that break because if they know it's coming, right? And so that's why we expand our data collection to be a little bit longer, so that we're getting bouts of behavior that we think are representative to their activities. We schedule the wear break so that there's always a weekend day included in the data collection as well as weekdays. So they don't get to decide, like we kind of look at when they start wearing the sensors and organize it that way. But knowing the break is coming, and our feedback from a co-design kind of model tells us that when they know that break is coming, it absolutely helps with the adherence component.
So just real quick before I let Diane go, do you follow up with them when it's time to put the sensors back on, or do they do all of that themselves?
A fantastic question. We thought particularly in the SuperAgers, and we have our scheduled check-in visits, like our 5-10 minute Zoom calls that we've scheduled throughout the wearing period. We had that timed for when they needed to put the sensor back on. But what we have discovered is that more than half the time, people have already put their sensors back on before we get them on the call. Like we get them on the call, they're like, look, I've already got it. We're like, fantastic, right? Can I just check that? Can you pan your camera down so I can see? Or their smartphone, whatever they're using for the call. So we have been really surprised at the fact that they actually don't need us to put these sensors back on. We still do the check-in call. It just lets us verify that it's on and it's there. The speech-based sensor, we can monitor that remotely because we've got cloud offload from, the charging mechanism I mentioned. So I can monitor that. But for the others, we just make sure that the battery, that the Vidium light isn't on, telling us that the battery's gone down or something. But those calls are really 5 minutes in duration. And most of the time they've already got the sensor on, back on and in place, even the ECG sensor. So.
Diane?
Thank you for this talk. There's so much about what you're doing that I enjoyed and appreciated. I mean, I liked that there's been knowledge for a while about some of these behavioral patterns that influence healthy aging, sleep and activity and social interaction, but you have physical evidence now of those and of some new things that I hadn't thought about before, like regularity. And I also really like that you were focusing on modifiable behaviors and the stories you had about how this led to action, because what good is the information if you can't do anything about it? So I was wondering, in light of the fact that some of your participants did take an action and they went and communicated with others and followed up, were there suggestions for additional new behavior markers to consider in ongoing study?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm not sure that the answer lies in the quantitative data that we have from the surveys, but I do think, so I will say we have qualitative data as well from those interviews. And I have a graduate student in my lab now they're just about to wrap up that qualitative analysis. And there are some interesting themes that have emerged from that. And one of the things that kind of came up is, again, and strangely enough, in this sleep space, right? So two things that and we have paid attention to this before, but are working our analytics with a little bit more diligence to try to get out, which is this idea of, restless sleep, or people who are getting up at night, people who are getting up and making sandwiches and going back to bed. And so how do we really capture that so that we're understanding different degrees of sleep fragmentation? Do you know what I mean? And so when people, and because you can certainly see them moving in the night, but they're actually doing things like just sitting up on the edge of the bed and doing exercises in the middle of the night, right? There's, people do strange behaviors. So I think the values that people had the most difficulty trusting, and by that, I mean, no matter what we saw or how we explained it to them, they were convinced they were sleeping worse or better than what they were. But it's always in the sleep data because, again, they perceive that they're getting up and doing, they're knitting in the middle of the night, for heaven's sake. And so one of the things that I think we've got to capture better and that helped us kind of understand what we need to be looking at in sleep is it's not just fragmentation, but maybe burst of other activity that's happening in that fragmented sleep space and what that possibly does in this context. And our analytics aren't that much different than everyone else. You look at people are sleeping or they're not, right? But we need to, I think, do a deeper dive to the type, not, the activity characterization of what's happening when people sleep. So that's what I would say is has been a challenge for us to kind of think about in the analytic space purely. But from the sharing space, right? If we think about what the feedback reports are conveying, one of the things that I think has come up time and time again as we look at these data, it's showing up in the qualitative data as well. And I didn't present that today, but there's a pretty robust correlation or association between whether or not they shared the report with someone and they made a health behavior change. So this real, we know this, right? We talk about it in the literature, but I think this is another layer of evidence that shows direct relationship between the likelihood of making a behavioral change and their ability to engage a partner, friend, family, or someone in that space. So there's a brilliant correlation between the two. We're also looking at what other predictors might go along with the likelihood of making a change. But right now, the most robust one is if they felt comfortable engaging someone else and sharing the report, then they were much more likely to make the behavior change. And I think this is important when we start thinking about how we convey information from wearable sensors or digital health technologies. Are we really creating it in a way that's inviting and facilitating people to share this information with others? Because just like for us, that seems to be a powerful association for health behavior change.
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack in what you said, and I'll be thinking about it. Thank you.
Yeah, I see it's past 3. I would love to stay on a little bit longer, Angela, if you have time to talk about a few things, but just want to let people go if they need to go, and obviously let you go too, Angela, if you need to go, and we can talk on the back end.
I'm happy to stay around if there are folks who have other questions. Marina, I don't mind to talk.
Okay, does anyone else have any other questions at this point? Jess, do you have one?
Okay, yeah. I'm so sorry. I have a terrible internet connection working from home, but this was an incredible talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. I'm actually a child development researcher, so other end of the spectrum, but very, very interested in the social engagement aspect of the wearable sensors and just getting into wearable technology in general. And I don't know if you have time now or maybe later, but I would love to know, how did you start getting people to create these sensors for you to capture things like social engagement? And how can I do this in my work as well?
I think the first answer is I'm incredibly naive and I know what I don't know, but I'm also not afraid to ask. And I think in this case, when it came to building out the speech sensor, I knew that what we had for data collection, just data logging devices was not effective. We already knew how to do some of the analytics on the backside. But the data logging devices were just not and Lena systems, all those things are not fantastic. For my group, they're not fantastic. They work a little bit better in pediatrics, but they don't work well for adults. And we really wanted devices that people could go out into their community, right? We didn't want people carrying a packet around their chest, right, with this Lena device in it, recording them and everyone else in their environment, right? So I think as we first started, I was clear about what the problem was. I knew what that was. I banged on enough doors until I found engineers who were receptive to listening. But I also had taken a stab at trying to make a schematic of what I knew the device needed to do, and could demonstrate to them that if we could collect the data, I could analyze it and we could do something meaningful with it. And so that's actually where it started. I spent a lot of time in the labs, just like we co-design our protocols. I co-designed with the engineers. I spent time in the lab standing there. I did the basic science that helped them to understand what the microelectronics needed to be able to do. What was the sampling frequency? What did we need to be thinking about? I didn't leave that to them. It was really a partnership all the way through. And then we worked with the FDA to get device clearance. Had several SBIR grants from NIH to be able to support the development. So I think, and this is in part what we do in the collaborative specialization, it's about learning the language that and the expertise and valuing the expertise that you bring to the table and not being intimidated in the engineering space, right? Not being worried. You're not expected to know how to build the circuits, but you are expert of the content and the behaviors that you need those circuits to be able to work with. And I think when you value yourself and you take that into the relationship and you make it about an equal partnership, it makes all the difference in the world. They want to build cool stuff. And so highlighting a problem that is interesting, right, that is both technically interesting, but also societally interesting is important for engineers and people who build out hardware. They don't often get the chance to do that. So I think holding your own, finding the right partners, being patient through that process, being willing to do the legwork and the homework that basically creates the use case and the framework so that they just have to put their technical solution, and then being one who engages all the way through the co-design and the trialing and all of those processes. You may not have to create something so far that the form factor of the sensor we have actually has a pediatric version to it. We've not necessarily used it so far for social analytics in kiddos, but there's a form factor of the sensor we built that is actually was used during COVID for infant cough response and to monitor, tiny babies who were sick, who needed to maybe go home with parents, but who still needed monitoring. So there's a form factor of the device that might not work so bad for what you want to do. But I think, my biggest piece of advice is just know what you bring to the table and don't back down from that worth and be willing to be open to being vulnerable to what you don't know, but holding your ground for what you do bring to the partnership.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that advice and guidance. And this was awesome and inspiring. So thanks.
Maureen,
Does
would
anyone
probably
else
get
have
the same,
any?
I think, Maureen, you would get the same advice, right, from your experience, right? I don't think that's
Yes, and we
community.
have wonderful engineers
Yeah.
and computer scientists at WSU. Diane's group being one of them, but there are also lots of others too.
Yeah, you're in a fantastic space for that to happen, but it's also about building your skills too. Like, I must say I'm pretty darn savvy at machine learning these days, but if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I was not, do you know? So I think being willing to cross into that space and learn a new skill, right? And it's also really important because it shows your willingness to cross boundaries, and then expecting your partners to do a little crossing into your space too.
Anyone else have a question? So Angela, I would love to get a hold of one of those reports. And I guess I was curious about